The Oklahoma frontier showed no mercy to the weak, and Nora Voss had run out of strength 3 days ago. Her husband was dead. Her son was burning with fever. Every town had turned her away. When she fell at the gate of a lonely ranch belonging to a man who hadn't spoken kindly to anyone in years, she didn't expect to survive the night. What happened next changed both their lives forever. And what grew between two broken people who had every reason to give up on love will stay with you long after this story ends. Stay with us until the very last word. This one will hit you somewhere deep. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and become part of our family. We tell stories that matter every single week. Drop a like and tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The boy had stopped asking for water 2 hours ago, and that scared her more than anything. As long as Tommy was crying, as long as he was complaining, as long as he was pulling at her sleeve and whispering, "Mama, I'm thirsty," in that small cracked voice of his, Nora Voss could tell herself he was still fighting. Children who were still fighting made noise. They demanded things. They were inconvenient and exhausting and wonderful. But Tommy had gone quiet somewhere between the creek crossing and the rise of the hill she was currently climbing, and the quiet sat on Nora's chest like a stone she couldn't put down. She adjusted his weight against her shoulder. He was 6 years old and small for his age, always had been. Daniel used to call him Sparrow, said it like it was a compliment, though Nora could never be entirely sure, and even so, after 3 days of carrying him on and off across broken Oklahoma ground, with nothing in her stomach but fear and creek water, he felt like he weighed as much as the whole dead world. "Tommy," she joggled him gently. "Hey, talk to me." A sound, just a sound, not quite a word, but enough. She exhaled. "That's good. That's my boy." The road, if you could call it that, two pale tracks worn into the grass by wagon wheels, half swallowed by the late summer weeds, curved around the base of the hill and opened onto something she hadn't expected, a valley, shallow and wide, with a creek threading through it silver in the afternoon light, and on the far side, set back from the water by maybe a quarter mile, the dark shapes of buildings. A house, a barn, fences running in clean lines that suggested someone had cared, once, about keeping things in order. Nora stopped walking. She had stopped at 2 towns and 1 homestead over the past 4 days. In Garfield, the woman at the general store had looked at Tommy's flushed face and taken 2 steps back, said something about a fever going around, said she couldn't have them inside. In Cutler Creek, the sheriff had been polite enough, almost apologetic, but the boarding house was full and the doctor was 3 days' ride east, and he was very sorry, but there wasn't much he could do for a widow with no money and a sick child. At the Hendricks homestead 15 miles back, the man of the house hadn't even let her finish her sentence. Just looked at her, looked at Tommy, and said, "We got our own troubles, ma'am," and shut the door. She had learned, in the months since Daniel died, that there was a particular kind of shame that came with needing help. It was different from ordinary embarrassment. It got into your bones. It made you want to apologize for existing, to shrink yourself down until you took up less space, less air, less of whatever resource it was that people seemed to think you were stealing from them just by being desperate. She was done apologizing. She was also, she realized, out of options. Nora shifted Tommy's weight again and started down toward the valley. Well, up close, the ranch was bigger than it had looked from the hill. There was a main house, 2 stories, weathered gray-brown wood that had probably been painted at some point, though whatever color it had once been was long gone, and a barn that was in noticeably better repair than the house, which told you something about the man who lived here, though Nora couldn't have said exactly what. A water trough, a chicken coop, a smaller outbuilding she couldn't identify, 2 horses in a paddock near the barn, a roan and a dark bay, both of them watching her approach with the mild and curious interest of animals that had seen enough of the world not to be surprised by anything. There was no one in the yard. Nora pushed through the gate, iron, heavy, the hinge shrieking loud enough to make her wince, and crossed to the porch. 3 steps up. The boards were solid. She knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, harder this time, and her knuckles were raw and she didn't care. A sound from inside. Movement. The kind of heavy, deliberate footfall that suggested someone who was not in any hurry and did not appreciate being interrupted. The door opened. The man standing in the doorway was tall, not imposingly so, but enough that Nora had to look up, with dark hair that needed cutting and several days of beard growing in uneven along his jaw. He was somewhere in his late 30s or perhaps 40, hard to say, with the kind of face that had been weathered by outdoor work into something that gave very little away. His eyes were gray, or possibly a dark green. The light was bad. And they moved from her face to Tommy and back to her face with an expression that wasn't quite suspicion and wasn't quite concern. Something between. "I need help," Nora said. She had promised herself she wouldn't lead with that, had planned to ask about work, offer something in exchange, give him a reason to say yes before he had the chance to think of reasons to say no. But Tommy made another small sound against her shoulder, and the plan fell apart. "My son is sick. He's been feverish for 3 days, and I need water and somewhere to put him down. I'm not asking for charity. I'll work. I'll do whatever you need done, but let me see him." The man's voice was low and not unkind exactly, but not warm either. It was a voice that had gotten out of the habit of being used for conversation. He stepped off the porch. She hadn't expected that, had expected the usual routine of looking and considering and ultimately declining, and came down the steps toward her and put his hands on Tommy without waiting for permission, tilting the boy's face up, pressing 2 fingers to his neck just below the jaw, pulling one eyelid down to check something Nora couldn't see. "How long since he drank anything?" "This morning, creek water. He's been keeping it down, but barely. Fever's high." Not a question. He was already moving, already turning back toward the house, and it took Nora a half-second to understand that this meant she should follow. She followed. The inside of the house was dim and smelled like wood smoke and something faintly chemical, linseed oil maybe, and not like people, not the way houses usually did. It had the particular quality of a space that was kept functional rather than lived in. Clean enough, but without any of the accumulated clutter of daily life, no boots by the door or coats on hooks or photographs on the walls. The furniture was solid and old and arranged as if someone had put it there once and hadn't thought about it since. The man led her to a room off the main hallway. A bedroom, small, with a narrow bed, and a window that looked onto the side yard, and pulled the covers back and held out his arms. Nora set Tommy down on the bed. Her arms ached with the release. Tommy's eyes opened part way. He looked at the ceiling, then at the man beside him with a child's slow, fever-blurred assessment. "Who are you?" he said. Not quite a question. "Elias," the man said. "This is my ranch." "I'm Tommy." "I know. Your mother told me." Tommy seemed to accept this. His eyes drifted closed again. Nora stood at the foot of the bed and watched her son breathe and felt something give way in her chest. Some structure that had been holding itself rigid for days, weeks, maybe longer. She pressed her fingers hard against her mouth and breathed through her nose and did not cry. Because she had learned that crying made men uncomfortable, and she couldn't afford to make this particular man uncomfortable right now. Elias was already moving again. Out of the room, back down the hallway, the sound of water running from somewhere in the back of the house. He returned with a cloth wrung damp in a tin cup and a small dark bottle that he set on the bedside table. "Get his boots off and loosen his collar," he said, cold cloth on his neck. "Here." He touched a point just below his own ear, and under his arms. "That'll bring the fever down faster than anywhere else." "Have you treated fever before?" He looked at her, just looked briefly. "Some." She didn't push. She got Tommy's boots off. Worn leather, too small for him now, she'd been meaning to replace them for months, and loosened the top buttons of his shirt while Elias poured something from the dark bottle into the tin cup and added water from a pitcher on the dresser and stirred it with one finger. "What is that?" she asked. "Willow bark, mixed with something else." He must have seen something in her face because he added, "It won't hurt him." "I wasn't—" She stopped. "Thank you." He handed her the cup without responding. Tommy drank and slept, and his breathing evened out after about an hour. Nora sat beside the bed in the room's one chair and watched him and listened to the sounds of the house around her, the occasional creak of footsteps somewhere overhead, the distant sounds of the barn, wind against the windows. At some point, the light coming through the glass turned orange and then gray. and she realized she had been sitting in the dimming room without lighting the lamp on the dresser, just sitting because she didn't have the energy to do anything else. The door opened. Elias stood in the threshold with the lamp from the hallway in his hand. "He's keeping the color," he said, looking at Tommy. "That's good. Fever might break tonight. Has it gone down?" "Some." He came in and lit the lamp on the dresser and set the one he'd brought on the table by the door. The room filled with warm light. "You should eat something." "I'm fine." "You haven't eaten today." She started to ask how he could possibly know that, and then realized it was obvious. From the way she'd come to his door, from the way she was carrying herself, from any number of things a person paying attention would notice. She felt heat come up in her face. "I don't want to be more of an imposition than I already am." Elias looked at her for a long moment, the same way he'd looked at her when she first arrived, assessing, but not unkindly, not yet decided about her, but not hostile either. "There's soup on the stove," he said. "It's been there since noon. You're welcome to it." He left before she could answer. Down. The kitchen was at the back of the house, larger than she'd expected, with a long work table down the center and a wood stove that was throwing good heat. The soup was vegetable, thick, probably made from whatever was in the garden. She'd seen a kitchen garden through the window, overgrown and neglected but still producing. She ladled some into a bowl and sat at the table and ate it too fast and had to slow herself down deliberately. Elias came in while she was on her second bowl. He poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove and sat down at the far end of the table with the unself-conscious ease of a man on his own territory who hadn't needed to adjust himself for anyone's comfort in a long time. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "East of here." "Millhaven." "That's 4 days' walk." 3.5. "I had the wagon until the wheel broke, left it about 12 miles back on the Creston Road. She'd left Daniel's old rifle in the wagon, too, which she was still angry about, though there had been no way to carry it and Tommy both. My husband died in June. We were going to go west, he and I, and then—" She stopped. "And then we didn't." Elias said nothing. "I'm not looking for sympathy," she said, because she'd learned that stating it outright was easier than waiting for people to offer something they weren't sure how to give. "I just want you to understand the situation. I have no money. I have no property. I have a sick child and nothing else. I'm asking for work. Actual work. I'm not fragile. I can do whatever needs doing, in exchange for somewhere for Tommy to recover, and whatever you can spare for wages. When he's well enough to travel, I'll move on." Elias turned the coffee cup in his hands. His hands were large and scarred in the way of men who worked with them constantly. Not clumsily, just marked the accumulated small damages of years. "What kind of work did you do?" he said. "Before Daniel, I kept house and ran a small laundry. During, I helped manage the farm books and kept the accounts. I can cook, I can mend, I can plant and harvest, I can handle horses. I can shoot." A pause. "My shooting is better than my cooking." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. Close, maybe, to what a smile was on its way to becoming before it reconsidered. "The garden needs work," he said, "and the house." "I can see that." "I'm not a good judge of what a house needs. I know what I can ignore." "Most things, from the look of it." This time the almost smile made it further. Not all the way, but further. He stood up and set his cup in the basin. "There's a room at the top of the stairs," he said. "It's been empty, but it's clean. Your son can stay where he is until he's better. In the morning, we can talk about terms." He left the kitchen. Nora sat at the table with her bowl and the dying stove heat, and the strange feeling of having been given something she hadn't expected and didn't know what to do with. She slept in the chair by Tommy's bed. She hadn't meant to. Had planned to wait until she was sure he was stable and then find the room upstairs. But when she sat down to check on him around midnight, she was asleep within minutes, out like a light someone had simply blown, dreamless and deep. She woke to gray morning light, and Tommy watching her from the pillow with eyes that were clearer than they'd been in days. "Mama," he said. "Hey, Sparrow." She leaned forward and pressed her hand to his forehead. "Cool. Not all the way down, but dramatically improved. The relief that moved through her was almost physical, like something releasing in her spine. "I'm hungry," Tommy said. She laughed. It came out a little rough, like laughing muscles that needed warming up. "Yeah, I know. That's a good sign. Where are we?" "A ranch. A man named Elias helped us." Tommy processed this. "Is he nice?" She thought about the careful hands checking Tommy's pulse on the front porch, the cold cloth at the right spots, the soup on the stove, the way he hadn't asked her to thank him for any of it. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "He's something." Guys, she found Eliason's barn before breakfast, tending to the roan horse, working a brush along its flank with the systematic attention of someone who found the task meditative. He didn't look up when she came in, but he wasn't startled either. He'd heard her coming, she suspected. He seemed like a man who was always aware of where the exits were, who was walking toward him, how much distance stood between himself and whatever might happen next. "Tommy's fever broke," she said. "I know. I checked on him an hour ago." She hadn't heard him, which bothered her slightly. "He's asking for food. There are eggs. He can have whatever you make." She stayed in the barn doorway. The roan turned its big head to look at her with one dark eye. Outside, the early morning was pale and quiet, the sun just clearing the ridge to the east and laying long shadows across the yard. "I want to be clear about something," Nora said. Elias kept brushing. "All right. I told you last night I'd move on when Tommy was well. I meant that. I'm not trying to attach myself to something that isn't mine. I know how that looks, a widow with a child showing up at a single man's door. I know what people think. What people think isn't my concern. It may become your concern if I stay." He stopped brushing, turned and looked at her straight, which was the first time he'd done that with both of them standing in full light. And she saw that his eyes were green after all, a dark, complicated green, and that they were tired in the way of someone who had been tired for a long time and had stopped expecting not to be. "What are you asking me?" he said. "I'm asking if the offer of work is real, or if it was just for the one night." A pause. The roan shifted and stamped. "It's real," Elias said. "Then I'd like to take it." He turned back to the horse. "Garden's worse than it looks. There's a fence section down on the north pasture. I've been meaning to fix it for 3 weeks. I can start today, after you eat." He said it without looking at her. "And after the boy eats, he needs more broth today, not solid food yet." "I know how to take care of my son." "I know you do." And somehow, said evenly and without any particular edge, it didn't land like criticism, just like the truth as he saw it. Nora turned and went back to the house to make breakfast. She spent the first week finding the edges of things. The garden was, as he'd said, worse than it looked. About a third of the planted rows had gone to competing weeds, and there were spots near the fence where the soil had compacted until nothing was going to grow through it without serious persuasion. She spent 3 afternoons on her knees working through it with a hand fork while Tommy sat on a blanket nearby, still weak but improving visibly each day, building small structures out of sticks and pebbles with the focused creativity of a boy who had been cooped up too long. The house she approached more carefully. It was clean. Elias was clearly not a man who lived in disorder, but it was bare in a way that went beyond practicality, in a way that felt deliberate, like someone had removed things rather than simply not acquired them. There were hooks on the wall with nothing on them, shelves with spaces that had the particular blankness of places where objects used to be and weren't anymore. She noticed these things and didn't mention them because she understood intuitively that they were not her business. What she did was small and practical. She patched the curtain in the kitchen that had a tear along the bottom hem. She reorganized the pantry, which was overstocked in some areas and mysteriously empty in others, and made a list of what needed replenishing. She cleaned the winter ash out of the second-floor fireplace that no one appeared to have used in some time. She fixed a loose board on the porch stairs. Elias noticed. She knew he noticed because every now and then she would catch a fractional pause in whatever he was doing, a moment where he registered a change, and then he would move on without commenting. She wasn't sure whether this was approval or indifference. She found she wanted it to be the former and then felt irritated with herself for wanting it. But on the 7th evening, Tommy followed Elias to the barn. Nora saw it from the kitchen window, her son's small figure trotting to keep up with the man's longer stride, Elias either not noticing or not discouraging. She went to the barn door and listened from outside. "What's her name?" Tommy was asking. "Which one?" "The one with the spots." "She doesn't have spots." "She does. Here and here." A pause where Tommy was presumably pointing. "That's Bess, and those aren't spots, those are where the color is uneven in the coat. It's different." "What's the difference?" "Spots are usually circular, more distinct. What Bess has is more of a pause. Elias clearly trying to explain something he'd never thought about articulating before. A variation in the base color, like different colored threads woven together. "Oh." Tommy appeared to consider this. "Can I brush her?" "Not tonight. Brush gets lost in there, and you'd be at it until dark." "I wouldn't get lost." "The brush would. It's not the same brush as the other horses, and you'd mix them up." "Why does that matter?" "Because one of them has a skin condition, and I'm not spreading it around." "Which one?" "Not Bess." "Then can I brush Bess?" A very long pause. Nora covered her mouth to keep from making noise. "Come here," Elias said finally, in the voice of a man who had run out of logical objections. "I'll show you how." Nora went back to the kitchen and finished making dinner, and when the two of them came in 20 minutes later with their boots filthy and Tommy with straw in his hair, she set plates in front of both of them and didn't say a word about it. The problems with Tanner's Crossing started in the second week. The town was 7 miles from the ranch, close enough to matter, far enough that Nora hadn't gone yet. When she finally made the trip in Elias's wagon to pick up the supplies she'd listed, she went alone and returned unsettled in a way she didn't immediately share. She'd gotten what she needed. The man at the general store, Pullum, the sign said, E. Pullum and Sons, had been civil enough in the way of a man performing civility over the top of something else. The woman behind her in line at the counter had moved back slightly when Nora stepped up, a shift of maybe a foot, almost imperceptible, like an instinct she hadn't fully finished having. Outside loading the wagon, Nora had heard the conversation starting behind her with the studied loudness of people who want you to know they're talking about you but can maintain deniability. That the ward woman? Can't be a ward woman. He ain't married. Not yet, is what I heard. Showed up at his door last week, her and a boy. Sick child, Millard Pretch said. Convenient timing, you want my opinion. His wife's only been gone 3 years. Some people don't wait long to look for a replacement. Nora had finished loading the wagon and climbed up and driven away without looking back. She was good at that now. She'd had practice. What bothered her was not the talk. She'd expected the talk. What bothered her was the 3 years. She hadn't known that Elias's wife had died, hadn't known there had been a wife, hadn't known what shape the emptiness in the house had taken or who had left it. 3 years. She thought about the bare hooks, the empty shelves, the second-floor fireplace nobody used. She thought about the way he moved through his own house like a guest who'd been there long enough to know where things were but hadn't put his own mark on anything. She understood that better than she wanted to. She didn't bring it up. She wasn't sure it was hers to bring up. What she did was keep working and let Tommy keep his evening visits to the barn, and notice gradually that the shape of their days was acquiring a rhythm she hadn't designed but didn't feel any urgency to disrupt. Elias was not an easy person to know. He wasn't hostile. She kept waiting for hostility, for the slow reveal of whatever it was that made men difficult, because in her experience there was always something. But he was contained in a way that made her uncertain how much of himself he was showing and how much was behind the wall. He answered questions directly and asked very few of his own. He was fair in a way that felt reflexive rather than considered, like fairness was his default setting and he'd never thought too hard about it. There were things she noticed that she filed without knowing quite what to do with. The way he picked up Tommy once, when her son had tripped on the barn threshold and landed hard, just reached down and set him upright without making a production of it, checked his palms for cuts, said, "You're fine," in a tone that was both matter-of-fact and strangely gentle. The way he ate his dinner with the same focused, contained attention he brought to everything, not rushing, not lingering, The way he sat on the porch some evenings after Tommy was in bed and looked at the ridge to the west while it went dark, not talking, not drinking, just sitting with whatever was in his head. She sat with him once, without intending to, had come out for air and found herself not going back inside, sitting in the other chair with her mending until it was too dark to see the stitches. They didn't say anything for a long time. "How bad's the north fence?" she finally asked, because it seemed safer than the questions she was actually thinking. "2 sections down and a third that won't last the winter. I can help with that tomorrow if you tell me what you need." "You've mended fence before?" "My husband's family had a farm. I grew up on it, more or less." "You learn what you need to learn." Elias was quiet for a moment. "What happened to the farm?" "Bad harvest, 2 years running. Then Daniel got sick and we sold what was left of it to cover the doctor. Then he died anyway." She said it flat, the way she'd learned to say it, without inflection that would invite the particular uncomfortable compassion of people who didn't know what to do with it. "We were going west to start over. I still have the plan, just not the person I was supposed to do it with." The dark was full now, the ridge invisible, the first stars out. "I had a plan too," Elias said. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Nora set her mending in her lap and looked at the sky. After a moment, she said, "The town's talking about me." "The town talks about everything. They think I'm—" She paused, choosing the word, "positioning myself." "Are you?" It startled her enough that she looked at him. He was watching her in the dark with that level, assessing look. "No," she said. "I know," he said. "I asked anyway." She couldn't quite read the tone. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't quite a test. It was something else, something she didn't have a clean word for. The question of a man who wanted to know where things stood and had decided that asking directly was better than guessing. "I'll be clear with you," she said, "the same way I was clear the first morning. I'm here to work and to keep my son safe. When I have enough saved to move on with some margin, I'll go. I'm not angling for anything else. If that's what people are saying, they're wrong." Elias nodded, turned back to the dark ridge. "They were saying it before you got here," he said, "about other things. It doesn't stop." "I know. I'm not concerned about it. You might want to be, for your own sake." He was quiet again. Then, "I've never been good at caring what people thought was appropriate for me." Nora looked back at the sky. The stars were out in full now, the Milky Way a pale smear overhead, and the night was starting to cool in the way of late summer prairie nights when the heat of the day finally let go. "Tommy asked me today if we were going to stay," she said. Elias didn't answer right away. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know." That was honest. I'm usually honest, even when it's not the easier thing. She heard him shift in the chair beside her. Not toward her, not away. Just a small recalibration, the way a person moves when they're settling in for a longer conversation or deciding not to have one. "I don't know either," he said, "but you're not in my way." From Elias Ward, she was starting to understand that was not a small thing. She nodded, and they sat with the night until the chill finally drove them in, and neither of them said anything else, and that was all right. The third week brought rain. Not the soft, apologetic kind that passed through and left everything smelling clean, the kind that settled in and meant business. 3 days of gray sky and water coming down steady enough to turn the yard to mud and keep the horses restless in the barn and drive everyone inside for longer than any of them were used to. Tommy, still building his strength back and not yet allowed to run the way 6-year-olds needed to run, was climbing the walls by the second afternoon. Nora found him at the top of the stairs pretending the banister was a ship's railing, which she put a stop to, and then at the kitchen table trying to get the ranch cat, a large, opinionated orange animal named Nothing, as far as she could tell, since Elias had never been heard to call it anything, to sit still while he arranged small stones around it in patterns. The cat tolerated this with the compressed dignity of something that had decided patience was more efficient than resistance. Elias was at the table too, working through what appeared to be a stack of ledgers and papers that had been waiting for a rainy day in the most literal sense. He had the focused, slightly pained expression of a man who was competent at most things and had never made peace with the ones he wasn't. Nora poured herself coffee and sat down across from him with the mending basket and didn't say anything for a while. "You're doing it wrong," she said finally. He looked up. "The books?" "The column on the right. You've carried the wrong number down from the third line. It's throwing off everything after it." He looked back at the page. A pause. "How do you know that?" "Because I can see it from here, and the sum on the bottom doesn't match what it should be given the line items." Another pause, longer. He turned the ledger around and pushed it across the table. She set down her mending, found the error in about 15 seconds, and pointed to it. He looked where she was pointing, made a sound that was not quite a word, and pulled the ledger back. "I've been trying to find that for an hour," he said. "You were too close to it. That happens." He looked at her with the particular expression of a man recalibrating something. "You said you kept accounts." "For 4 years. Daniel was better at the planting and I was better at the numbers, so that's how we split it. Can you—" He stopped, started again, which cost him something. She could see that. "The county tax filing is due in 6 weeks and I haven't been able to make it balance for 3 months. I can look at it. I'd pay you separately. It's not part of what we—" "Elias." She picked up her mending again. "Just let me look at it." He was quiet for a moment, and then he reorganized the stack and set the relevant pages in front of her. And that was that. Tommy, who had been listening to all of this with the selective attention of a child who tunes in at unpredictable moments, looked up from his stone arrangements and said, "My mama's really good at numbers." "So I'm learning," Elias said. "She used to do them in her head. Papa would write them down and Mama would already have the answer before he was done writing." "Tommy," Nora said, "it's true. I know it's true. You don't have to narrate." Tommy considered this and returned to his stones. The cat had used the distraction to remove itself to the windowsill, where it sat with its back to the room and the air of something that had made a unilateral decision. She found the error in the county ledger by the following morning. There were actually 3 errors, 2 that were genuinely mistakes, and 1 that looked like a recording choice that was technically not wrong but was going to create problems if the county assessor interpreted it the way the county assessor was likely to interpret it, given what she knew about how counties thought about grazing rights and shared water. She explained all 3 to Elias over breakfast. He listened in the way she was coming to recognize as characteristic of him, fully attentive, not interrupting, processing everything before responding. "The grazing rights one," he said when she finished. "How do you know how the county assessor reads it?" "My father-in-law had a dispute with the Hendricks County assessor for 2 years over something similar. It cost him $60 and a lot of aggravation before they resolved it. The wording in your ledger is ambiguous the same way his was." "What do you suggest?" "Reword it. I can show you." "All right." She rewrote the relevant entry while he watched, and he read it and said, "That's cleaner." And that was the closest he came to thank you, which she was already learning to translate. The rain broke on the 4th day, leaving the world washed and the mud in the yard ankle-deep in places, and the north fence worse than it had been before, 2 more sections having given up under the weight of wet and wind. Elias went out to assess the damage and came back with the particular set to his jaw that meant the scope of something had turned out larger than expected. "I need to get to the north pasture today," he said. "The cattle are getting through." "I'll come." He looked at her. "It's a full day's work. Ground's wet." "I know what wet ground is." She was already pulling her coat off the hook. "Tommy can stay in the house for a few hours. He'll be fine." She looked at her son, who was eating porridge at the table with the focused intensity of someone fueling up. "Tommy, you stay inside today. No porch, no yard, not until the mud dries. Understood?" Tommy looked at the window, assessed the mud with visible disappointment, and said, "What if the cat wants to go out?" "The cat is smarter than both of us and will manage its own schedule." "Okay." She and Elias went out together. It was the first time she'd worked directly alongside him for an extended period. Previous to this, she'd been in the garden while he was in the barn, or in the house while he was in the fields. And she found she had to readjust her understanding of him slightly. He worked fast, but not carelessly, moving from task to task with an efficiency that came from knowing exactly what needed doing in what order and having done it so many times that the sequence was physical rather than considered. He didn't explain what he was doing, didn't check to see if she was keeping up, didn't treat her like she needed managing. She matched his pace, and he noticed and didn't say anything, and that was fine. They fixed 4 sections of fence by mid-afternoon. The work was hard in the way of all outdoor physical work when the ground is uneven and wet, and the materials are heavier than convenient, post-pounding and wire stretching, and the particular frustration of staples that wouldn't set right on the first hit. She split the skin on 2 knuckles on a wire end and wrapped a piece of cloth around her hand and kept going. Elias glanced at it once and didn't comment, which she appreciated. At some point in the middle of the afternoon, working on the 3rd section, he said without preamble, "My wife's name was Clara." Nora kept her hands on the wire. "Okay. She died 3 years ago, March." He was driving a staple with careful, measured strikes. There were children. They didn't survive. Neither did she. She didn't say she was sorry. She'd had enough sorry said to her to know it mostly landed wrong. "How long were you married?" 7 years. "Was she from here?" "From Wichita originally. She came out with her family when she was 19. A pause. "She hated the winters. Every year she said we were going somewhere warmer, and every year we didn't go." He drove the last staple and straightened. "I should have taken her." Nora looked at him. The clean profile of his face against the gray sky, the set of his shoulders, the way the words had come out flat and deliberate, something he'd decided to say and was saying the same way he did everything, without flinching and without expecting comfort. "You couldn't have known," she said. "No." He moved to the next post. "But I could have listened." She let that sit. It was the kind of thing that didn't need a response. She picked up her end of the wire. They worked the last section mostly in silence, and it was a different kind of silence than the early days, less careful, less loaded. More like 2 people who had said something real and could now be quiet without it meaning anything had been avoided. On the way back to the house, walking the fence line with the empty wire spool and the post mall, Elias said, "The town's been talking to you." "I told you that." "I mean more specifically, Edna Pruitt came to the store while you were there." Nora glanced at him. "How do you know?" "Because Edna Pruitt manages the information of this county the way a mill manages grain. Everything goes through her eventually." A pause. "She'll have told you she was concerned for my welfare." "She told the woman behind me. She made sure I could hear." Elias made a sound that was the closest to a humorless laugh she'd heard from him. "She's been telling people I need a housekeeper and a clear head and should not be taking in strays." "Is that what I am?" "It's what she calls anyone she didn't personally approve in advance." He paused at the gate to the paddock, lifted the latch. "She said the same thing about Clara when I first brought her home. Called her a Wichita girl with city notions." He held the gate for Nora and let it close behind them. "Clara planted a rose garden just to irritate her. Kept it going for 6 years." Nora looked at the south side of the house, where the remnants of a rose garden were barely visible under the encroachment of weeds and grass. She hadn't known what those were. "It needs clearing out," she said. "I know." "I'll get to it." He looked at her sideways for a moment. Something in his face shifted, not all the way to anything readable, but shifted. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to." She tucked the cloth tighter around her split knuckles. "I want to." He looked away and didn't answer, and she couldn't tell if that was acceptance or something he was still deciding. She was learning that with Elias, those 2 states sometimes looked exactly the same. She cleared the rose garden over the course of 3 mornings, working before Tommy was fully awake and the day's heat settled in. Most of the plants were still alive, dormant or half overgrown but with root systems intact, the way roses had a habit of outlasting everything you expected them to outlast. She cut them back hard and cleared the weeds and turned the soil around the bases, and by the 3rd morning, it looked less like an accident and more like something intentional. She didn't tell Elias she was doing it. He saw anyway. One morning he came around the side of the house and stopped and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. And then he looked at her, kneeling in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up and her hair coming loose from its braid, and he said, "You didn't have to do that." You said that already. I know. He looked back at the roses. They'll bloom again, you think? Probably. Come spring. He nodded, slow, and went to the barn. Tommy, who had been watching all of this from the porch, with the careful attention he'd developed for any interaction between the adults in his orbit, said, "Did he like it?" "I think so." "He didn't say." "He doesn't always say." "That doesn't mean he doesn't." Tommy digested this with the seriousness of a 6-year-old filing important information. Papa always said things. People are different. Yeah. He jumped off the porch and landed in the dry dirt. Elias showed me how to tie a rope last night. I know, I saw. He said if I learn to do it right, he'll let me help with the horses. Nora looked at her son, healthier now than he'd been in months, the fever's shadows finally gone from under his eyes, his color good, filling out a little from regular meals. He looked like himself again. She hadn't realized how much she'd been bracing against the possibility that he wouldn't. "Do you like it here?" she asked. He looked around the yard, the barn, the paddock, the horses at the fence watching him. Yeah. Yeah? It's quiet. I like quiet. He paused, then added with the guileless accuracy of children. You're less scared here. Nora blinked. What? Before. You used to be scared when we were walking. I could feel it. He said it simply, no drama. You're not scared as much now. She didn't have an answer for that. She went back to the roses. Elias had a neighbor named Cutter, Roy Cutter, who ran a spread about 4 miles east and who had apparently been friends with Elias in the loose, low-maintenance way of men who respected each other's silences and showed up when there was a problem. He came by on a Tuesday with a broken wagon axle and borrowed Elias's spare and stayed for coffee. And Nora made the coffee and didn't think much of it until she heard the conversation from the kitchen. Town's talking, Cutter said. Let it. Just saying, Millicent Pruitt's been at the Reverend about it. About what specifically? About whether it's appropriate. A single man and a widow. A pause. People with nothing better to do, Elias, but they carry weight, some of them. She's working here. She and the boy. I know that. Then I don't see what the problem is. Cutter's voice shifted into the tone of someone choosing their words. The problem is the story they're telling is different, and the story they're telling has a way of becoming the thing that matters, regardless of what's actually happening. You know that. A silence. She's a decent woman, Elias said. She's not here for what they think she's here for. I believe you. Cutter's chair scraped back. But you want to think about whether decent women need protecting from what people decide to make of their situation. Nora set the coffee cups down quietly and stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the window and thought about Tanner's crossing, about the way the woman in line had shifted back, about the things said with careful loudness. She thought about how much of her life had been spent managing other people's stories about her. The widow, the woman with the sick child, the one too proud to beg properly, the one not proud enough, the one who showed up uninvited and stayed. She took the coffee in and set it on the table and sat down and said, without anything particularly combative in her voice, "What are they saying exactly?" Both men looked at her. Cutter had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. He was about 45, weathered and broad-shouldered, with an honest face that wasn't currently sure which direction to point itself. "Ma'am, you can tell me directly. I'm not fragile." A pause. Cutter looked at Elias, who gave him nothing in particular. "They're saying you've set yourself up to get into the Ward estate," Cutter said, "that you picked a vulnerable man and moved in before anyone could think to intervene." He said it flat, without relish. The way you deliver information that tastes bad and getting it over with quickly is the best option. Edna Pruitt told someone you reminded her of a woman she knew in Salinas who did something similar and ended badly. Nora absorbed this. And what do people who know Elias think? Some of them think he's old enough to make his own choices. Some of them think grief has made him an easy target. You understand, I'm just telling you what's circulating. I understand. She picked up her coffee. What do you think? Cutter looked at her for a moment with the steady, practical attention of a man making a judgment call. I think you've got more grit than most people I've met, and probably more sense than the half the county between them. A pause. I also think it doesn't matter what I think. It matters what they decide to do with the story. After Cutter left, Nora and Elias were in the kitchen together with the aftermath of the conversation sitting between them like a third person who hadn't excused themselves yet. "Does it change anything?" she asked. What he said. Elias was at the counter, not doing anything in particular. He turned around. "Does what change anything?" "What the town thinks. Whether it's better for me to—" She stopped. "If I'm creating a problem for you, you're not." "I could be." That's what he was saying. Cutter was being careful. He thinks careful is the same as correct. Elias sat back down at the table. "I don't care about the Pruitt woman's opinion of how I run my own property." "It's not just her opinion. If it gets to the county, if someone decides to make a formal, no one's making anything formal over two adults who have done nothing wrong. People make formal things over less." She set her cup down. "I've seen it." He looked at her across the table, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not irritation exactly, more like the set of a man who had thought something through and arrived at a position and was not moving from it. "Nora," he said, "I'm not asking you to leave." She held his gaze. "I'm not saying I should leave. I'm saying we need to be aware." "I'm aware." He leaned forward slightly. "I've been aware since you came through that gate. I know what this looks like to people who don't know anything about either one of us." A pause, measured. "I don't live my life according to what it looks like to people who don't know anything." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, Tommy was in the barn with the horses, probably talking to Bess with the dedicated one-sided conversational energy he brought to most animals. "Claire used to say I was too stubborn to live in a town," Elias said. "She meant it as a criticism. I took it as a compliment." "It's both," Nora said. That got her the real thing this time. Not the almost smile, not the movement in that direction, but an actual brief smile, there and gone, like sun through a fast-moving cloud. It changed his whole face for a second, and she caught herself thinking that she'd been trying to imagine what he looked like when he smiled, and it was not quite what she'd expected, and better. She looked away. "I'll go to town on Friday," he said. "Pick up the grain. You can come if you want. We can let them look all they want." She looked back at him. "That's your answer to the talk?" "My answer is to act like there's nothing to hide because there isn't." He stood up and took his cup to the counter. "You're good at the numbers, you're good with the land, and you're good with that boy. None of that is nothing." She wasn't sure what to say to that, so she said, "The north fence is still missing a section." "I know, tomorrow. I'll be there." "I know," he said again, and went back to his work. She went to town with him on Friday. She sat up on the wagon seat beside him, and they drove the 7 miles to Tanner's Crossing, and she watched people notice them from the moment they turned onto the main street, a paired attention that moved from window to doorway to sidewalk plank as they passed. She kept her back straight and her eyes forward and didn't offer anything to read. They did the errands without event, grain at the mill, dry goods at Pullum's. Elias exchanged the minimal necessary words with the men at the mill and the minimal necessary words with Pullum, who was professionally friendly in the way of a man who understood that ranchers were customers first and everything else second. Edna Pruitt was on the sidewalk in front of the mercantile. She was a tall woman, sharp-featured, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades being the most organized person in every room and had let it shape her posture. She looked at the two of them the way you might look at a problem you'd identified and not yet solved. "Elias," she said. "Edna." Her eyes moved to Nora with the practiced assessment of someone who filed information for later use. "And this must be your housekeeper." The pause before the word was surgical. Elias said, "This is Nora Voss. She manages the accounts and the property. She's been good for the ranch." The economy of that sentence, nothing extra, nothing apologetic, nothing that acknowledged the pause, was something Nora noticed and tucked away. "How generous of you," Edna said, which meant something else entirely. "How's your husband's knee?" Elias asked. "I heard he took a bad fall." A beat. Whatever Edna had planned to say next had been disrupted. "He's managing." "Good to hear. Tell him I asked." He put a hand briefly under Nora's elbow. Not gripping, just a touch, steering. And they moved past, and Edna didn't say anything else. The touch lasted about 4 seconds and then was gone, but Nora felt the shape of it for longer. In the wagon on the way back, she said, "That was deliberate." What was? Asking about her husband's knee. He did fall. I did hear about it. And the timing. He was quiet for a moment, watching the road. She was going to say something worse. I know how Edna works. Give her a different topic and she'll pursue that one instead. You're better at town politics than you pretend to be. I'm bad at most of it. Edna I've known for 20 years. That's not politics, that's just knowing where the lever is. Nora looked at the road ahead of them. The flat, pale road cutting through the dry grass, the sky enormous and tilting toward late afternoon gold. She thought about the brief pressure of his hand and then deliberately stopped thinking about it. Tommy wants to know if he can help at the fall harvest, she said. He's 6. He's a hard worker. He's 6 and he argues about brush selection in my own barn. He gets that from me, the arguing part, not the barn part. Elias made the sound that was almost a laugh. He can help with the lighter sorting, not around the equipment. He'll accept that. He'll negotiate. He will, Nora agreed, and this time the silence that followed was the easiest one yet. Something between them that had stopped requiring careful navigation, had become just 2 people on a road at the end of a day that had gone all right, headed back to a place that was starting, without any announcement, to feel like somewhere worth going back to. She didn't examine that feeling. She let it sit where it was, the way you let an unsteady thing settle before you decide what to do with it, and watched the light change over the grass and rode the rest of the way home. The roses had put out new growth by the 3rd week of September, small, determined green shoots pushing up from the cut-back canes. Not much to look at yet, but proof that the root systems had held through everything they'd been asked to hold through. Nora noticed them on a Tuesday morning and felt something she didn't immediately name, just stood there in the early light with her coffee going cold in her hand and looked at the green pushing through the old dead wood. Tommy found her there. He had developed the habit of appearing at her elbow without warning, which was less surprising than it used to be now that she wasn't constantly braced for disaster. "They're growing back," he said. "They are. Is that good?" "That's very good." He leaned against her arm and looked at the canes with her, and she put her free hand on his shoulder, and they stood like that for a minute in the quiet morning before the day demanded anything from either of them. Then Tommy said, "Elias is teaching me to read the sky for rain," and was gone back to the barn, and Nora went inside to start breakfast, and that was a morning like a dozen others they'd had by then, ordinary and unremarkable, and worth more than she could have said. The rhythm of the ranch had settled around all 3 of them in the way that rhythms do when nobody's forcing them, gradually, without announcement, until one day you notice the shape of a thing that's been forming for weeks. Elias was up before dawn, barn first, then coffee, then the day's work laid out with the efficiency of long habit. Nora came down maybe 30 minutes after, started breakfast, reviewed the accounts if there was reviewing to do, then moved to whatever the property needed. Tommy occupied a territory somewhere between them both, trailing Elias to the barn in the mornings, appearing in the kitchen midday with dirt on his hands, and questions about whatever he'd seen, doing his letters at the kitchen table in the evenings with the focused irritation of someone who understood that this was non-negotiable but hadn't made peace with it. They were not a family. Nora was careful about that. She was careful not to call it that even in the privacy of her own thinking, because naming a thing before it was solid was how you ended up with something that looked right and wasn't. But there was a structure there, something functional and warm, and she was not going to apologize for finding comfort in it. She should have known it wouldn't be allowed to simply continue. Okay. The writer came on a Wednesday, mid-morning, when Elias was out on the South Range, and Nora was in the kitchen working through the quarterly tallies. She heard the horse before she saw it, a fast, purposeful approach, not the ambling pace of someone making a social call, and went to the window and felt the recognition land in her stomach before her mind had fully processed what she was seeing. Vincent Gray had filled out since she'd last seen him at Daniel's funeral. He'd always been a big man, her husband's older brother, but he'd added weight that sat on him now as a kind of deliberate physical statement. a body that occupied more space than it needed to, that seemed designed to make other things feel smaller. He was wearing a good coat and a hat that cost more than most men in this county, spent on a month of supplies, and he sat the horse the way he sat in rooms, like he'd already decided the space was his. He dismounted at the gate, looked at the house with the unhurried appraisal of someone pricing a property. Nora set the papers down and stood up and breathed once, slow, and went to the door before he could knock. She opened it before he reached the porch. "Vincent?" she said. He stopped on the second step, smiled, which on Vincent Gray's face was a complicated event. "Nora, you're looking well." His eyes moved past her into the house, a quick inventory, assessing. "This is quite a place you've found yourself. What are you doing here?" "Well, that's direct." He came the rest of the way up the steps like she'd invited him. She didn't move from the doorway. He stopped about a foot from her, close enough to be deliberate, not close enough to be actionable. "I've been looking for you for 2 months. You're not easy to track." I wasn't trying to be found." "No, I gathered that." He looked past her again. "Is my nephew here?" "He's at his lessons." "Can I see him?" "You can tell me what you want first." The smile again, patient and practiced. "What I want is to see my brother's son. Daniel would have wanted—" "Don't." Her voice came out flat. "Don't do that. Daniel had a lot of opinions about a lot of things, and very few of them involved you." Vincent's smile didn't waver, but something behind it shifted slightly. He was used to people who went soft when he applied a certain kind of pressure, and she never had, which was part of why he'd never liked her. "Can we speak inside?" he said. "Civilly. There are things that need to be discussed." She stood aside, not because she wanted to, but because having this conversation on the porch where anyone passing on the road could see and anyone she couldn't anticipate could overhear was worse. He came in and looked around the kitchen with that same slow assessment, and she wanted to tell him that whatever he was adding up in his head was wrong, that this wasn't hers, that she hadn't come here to acquire anything. And then she thought better of it because explaining herself to Vincent Gray had never in her experience accomplished anything. She didn't offer him coffee. "Daniel's will," Vincent said, settling into a chair without being asked. "You know what's in it." "I know what's in it." "Then you know that Tommy has an inheritance held in trust, to be administered by a legal guardian until he reaches majority." "I'm his mother. I'm his legal guardian." "You are." A pause, that smile doing something complicated in the corners. A widowed mother with no property, no income, and no fixed address, who has been living on the generosity of a man she met 6 weeks ago. He looked at the kitchen around him. A man who is, by all accounts, a bachelor with land and money and no family. You can see how that reads. She kept her face still. "It reads like a woman working to support her son. It reads like a woman who found a convenient arrangement and is using it to stabilize herself while she waits for the right moment to make a move." He leaned back. "Nora, I'm not your enemy. I'm Daniel's brother. I want what's best for Tommy." "No," she said. "You want control of Tommy's inheritance and you're using him to get to it. You've always been more interested in Daniel's money than in Daniel." The patience in his face wore thin for just a second, just enough for her to see what was underneath it, before he recovered. "I have a legal right to petition for guardianship. Given your current circumstances, my circumstances are my own business. They're a court's business if I make it one." He stood up. "I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you how the law reads as someone who has spoken to a lawyer in Guthrie about exactly this question." He straightened his coat. "I'd like to see Tommy, and then I'll stay in town for a few days and give you time to consider what options make the most sense for everyone involved, particularly for a 6-year-old boy who deserves stability." The word stability in his mouth made her want to put something heavy through the window. "Tommy!" she called toward the back of the house. Tommy appeared in the kitchen doorway a moment later, looking between them with the careful alertness of a child who reads rooms. He'd been close enough to hear some of it, she suspected, which she'd have to address later. "This is your Uncle Vincent," Nora said, "from your father's family." Tommy looked at Vincent with the level, undefensive assessment of a child who hasn't yet learned to perform enthusiasm. "I remember you. You were at Papa's funeral." "That's right," Vincent said, and something in his voice shifted when he addressed Tommy. It became softer, more careful, a different register entirely. That was the thing about Vincent that made him dangerous. He was good with children. He knew how to make himself appear safe to the people who hadn't yet learned to read the gap between what someone said and what they meant. "You've gotten tall." "Mama says I'm growing," Tommy said. "Elias says I'll be tall enough to reach the top loft by next spring." "Elias?" Vincent repeated the name the way you repeat a thing to make sure you've got it right for later. "That's the man who owns this ranch?" "Yeah, he's teaching me to read rain clouds." Tommy paused. "He's not really that talkative, but he knows a lot of things." Vincent glanced at Nora over Tommy's head. The glance said, "I see. How convenient." She met it and gave him nothing back. Elias returned from the South Range at midday to find Vincent Gray's horse still tied at the gate and Nora in the kitchen with the particular stillness of someone managing a controlled internal temperature. He came in, registered the presence of a stranger's coat on the hook by the door, and looked at her. "Someone here," he said, "in the parlor. Vincent Gray. Daniel's brother." She kept her voice even. "He wants custody of Tommy." Elias didn't say anything for a moment. He set his hat on the table and went to the basin and washed his hands, which gave her a sense that he was thinking, not ignoring. "What's his claim?" he said. "That I'm unstable, financially and otherwise. That Tommy's inheritance needs a more reliable guardian." She paused. "He has a lawyer in Guthrie." Elias dried his hands, looked at her. "Does he have a case?" "Possibly. A woman with no property and no legal standing in this county, living on another man's charity." She said it the way he'd first said things about the fence and the ledger, so plain, without self-pity, because self-pity cost time she didn't have. A sympathetic judge might agree with him. "Then we fix the standing." "Elias, stay here." He went to the parlor. She stayed in the kitchen because he'd asked her to, and because she understood, for the first time in a long time, that someone was handling something on her behalf, and she could let them without it meaning she'd surrendered anything. She stood at the counter and listened. The voices from the parlor were not loud, but she could catch the shape of them. Elias's low and level, Vincent's carrying more warmth than he'd shown in the kitchen. The particular adjustment of a man recalibrating to a different audience. She heard Daniel's wishes and the boy's welfare from Vincent, and from Elias, something too quiet to catch, and then a pause, and then Vincent again, more careful now, and then the sound of someone standing up. Elias came back to the kitchen. Alone. "He's leaving," he said. "For how long?" "He said he'd be at the crossing house through the end of the week." Elias pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "He told me he has no quarrel with me personally and hopes I'll understand that his concern is purely for his nephew." "That's what he told me too." "I told him I'd think about it." She looked at him. "Think about what?" He was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was about to say something he'd organized carefully. "About the fact that the problem he's describing is real, even if his motives aren't. A woman with no legal standing in this county, living in a man's house without a formal arrangement, in front of a judge looks exactly like what Vincent wants it to look like." He met her eyes. "There are solutions to that." She heard what he wasn't saying yet, and felt the floor of her thinking shift slightly, like ground that had seemed solid and turned out to be over something deeper. "You mean marriage," she said. "I mean a legal arrangement that gives you standing, that makes Tommy's situation here a family situation rather than a charity situation, that takes Vincent's central argument and removes it." He said it straight. No performance, no romanticism coding it. "It would be a practical arrangement. You'd keep managing the accounts and the property. I'd keep the ranch. Tommy stays." She looked at him across the table. This man she'd known for 6 weeks, who had opened a door she hadn't expected anyone to open, who had let her son into his barn and his evenings and his rare, reluctant humor, who had told her about Clara in a wet field with no particular expectation of receiving anything back. Who had that morning but, she knew because Tommy had told her, gotten up before dawn to fix the loose latch on the chicken coop before the first hard cold came, which nobody had asked him to do. "Elias," she said, "you understand what you're saying." "I understand what I'm saying." "You'd be marrying a woman you've known for 6 weeks, a widow with a child and no money, and a brother-in-law trying to take that child away, in order in order to solve a solvable problem. His voice was steady. I'm not asking you to pretend it's something else. I'm telling you what it would be and why. She pushed back from the table and stood up and went to the window because she needed to not be sitting across from him while she thought about this. The yard was autumn dry now, the cottonwood near the fence going gold, Tommy's rope swing moving slightly in the breeze, the horses quiet in the paddock. What do you get out of it? She said. Not an accusation. A real question. He was quiet long enough that she turned around to look at him. I get someone who keeps the accounts straight and knows when to cut roses back, he said. And a boy who won't stop talking in my barn. A pause. And a house that feels like someone lives in it. She felt the weight of that, what it actually meant from someone like him, from a man who chose every word with the care of someone who didn't have many to spare. It would have to be real, she said, not a performance. If we do this in front of a court, it has to hold up. I know that. I'm not easy to live with. I argue, I have opinions about things that aren't strictly my business, and I will rearrange your pantry whenever I feel the organization is wrong. I know, he said, and there was something in the way he said it, not resigned, not reluctant, something closer to the quiet of a man who has looked at a thing clearly and decided it's all right. The pantry was wrong. Despite everything, the cold fear in her chest about Vincent, the weight of the decision, the enormity of what was being discussed across a kitchen table, and she almost laughed. She pressed it down. Tommy would need to be told carefully, she said. Agreed. And it can't be presented to him as a solution to a problem. He needs to understand it's, she searched for the right word, a choice that we made. I'll let you handle how you tell him. She crossed her arms over her chest, not defensively, but to hold herself steady. Give me a day. Take what you need. She looked at him, really looked, the way she'd been careful not to do too often in the past weeks, because she'd learned that looking at Elias Ward carefully had a cumulative effect she wasn't sure she trusted herself to account for. The gray-green eyes that gave nothing away without deciding to. The steadiness of him that wasn't coldness, that was something else. The particular quality of a man who had been taken apart by grief and had put himself back together into something that worked, even if the seam showed. Why are you doing this? She said. Not what she'd asked before. This was different. He looked at her for a long moment. Because it's the right thing to do. She waited. And because you're not nothing to me, he said, quiet and direct and without any attempt to dress it up. You haven't been for a while. She nodded, looked at the window, looked back. I'll tell you tomorrow, she said. What? She told Tommy that evening, after dinner, while Elias did the final barn check and the kitchen was quiet and warm. She sat across from her son at the table with the lamp between them and thought for a moment about how to begin, and then decided that Tommy, who had accurately assessed her fear level at 6 years old by feeling it through her shoulder, didn't need to be handled. I need to tell you something, she said, about us staying here. Tommy looked up from the page of letters he'd been laboring over. His eyes went sharp the way they did when he sensed something important. Are we leaving? No, it's the opposite, actually. She put her hands flat on the table. You know your Uncle Vincent came today. I heard some of it. He said it without apology. He wants to take me away. He thinks he has the right to ask for that. There are rules, laws, about who can take care of a child. And because we don't own anything here, and because I don't have a formal arrangement with Elias, the law might think he has a point. She watched her son's face, the way the information registered and settled. He was a thinker, Tommy, had always processed things quietly rather than reacting immediately. Daniel had been the same way. Elias has offered a solution. He's offered to marry me, so that we'd have legal standing here and Vincent couldn't make his argument. Tommy was quiet for a moment. Would you say yes? I'm thinking about it. I wanted to talk to you first. He looked at the page of letters in front of him for a moment, then back at her. Do you want to? She took a breath. I think it would be good for us. I think this is a good place, and Elias is a good man. And if I'm being honest, she paused because she'd promised herself she'd be honest. I'm not thinking about it only because of Vincent. I'm thinking about it because I'd like to stay. Tommy nodded slowly. Me too. Yeah? He said I could have a dog, Tommy said, When I'm older and can take care of it myself. She blinked. When did he say that? Last week, in the barn. He picked up his pencil again. I've been thinking about that for a week. She pressed her lips together to hold back the laugh. So that's a vote for staying. It's not about the dog, Tommy said, with the dignity of someone who wanted that on record. I like it here. I like him. A pause. He doesn't talk a lot, but when he says things, they're true. Papa talked a lot, and some of it was true. It was the most complicated thing she'd heard her son say about his father, and she didn't know quite what to do with it except to receive it. Elias would be... He wouldn't replace your father, she said carefully. I know. Tommy said it simply, like she'd said something obvious. But he could be something else. That's okay too. She looked at her 6-year-old son and thought that grief did strange, sometimes useful things to children, made them see clearly in places adults got blurred. Okay, she said. Go finish your letters. She told Elias yes the following morning, early, in the barn, while he was measuring feed and Tommy was still asleep. She said it without preamble because she'd learned that was how things went between them. Directly, without the scaffolding of people who were less sure of each other. Yes, she said from the barn doorway. He turned around. Something crossed his face, brief and difficult to name. Not surprise, not relief exactly, but something that lived adjacent to both of those things. He nodded. I'll go to the county office tomorrow, he said. File the paperwork. All right. There's no Reverend in Crossing. I'd ask for a favor, he said. Justice of the Peace and Guthrie will do it. That's fine. He turned back to the feed. Thank you, he said, to the wall or to her, or to both. She wasn't entirely sure. Don't thank me, she said. I'm saying yes because I want to. He turned back around at that and looked at her, and this time the something on his face stayed long enough for her to read it. And what she read was a man who had been braced for a transaction and had received something that felt different from a transaction and didn't know exactly what to do with that yet. She understood the feeling precisely. I know you are, he said. She went back to the house. They drove to Guthrie on a Thursday morning, all three of them in the wagon, Tommy in the middle on the bench seat between them, with his good shirt buttoned to the collar and his boots clean, which he had insisted on without being asked. The sky was high and blue and cold-edged, the cottonwoods along the road yellow, the smell of autumn cutting through the air. They didn't talk much on the drive. Tommy pointed out a hawk circling over a field, and Elias identified the species without looking very long, and Tommy filed this into his ongoing collection of things Elias knew, which had become extensive. The Justice of the Peace was a compact man named Hargrove, who had done this enough times to know the difference between couples who were nervous and couples who had thought something through, and he registered the latter about these two with the professional attention of someone who doesn't make it his business to ask why. He asked the necessary questions, received the necessary answers, filled in the necessary papers in a competent hand, and declared the thing done in about 15 minutes. Tommy, who had watched the whole proceeding with grave attention, said afterward on the courthouse steps, "Is that it?" "That's it," Nora said. He considered this. It was short. "It doesn't have to be long to be real," Elias said. Tommy absorbed this and seemed to find it satisfying. He went down the steps ahead of them to look at a dog tied to the post outside the hardware store, and Nora and Elias stood at the top of the courthouse steps in the cold autumn light and didn't say anything for a moment, because there wasn't much to say that the moment hadn't already said for itself. "He's right that it was short," Nora said. "Do you need it to be longer?" She looked at the street below them, at Tommy squatting down to let the dog sniff his hand with the fearless patience of a child who has decided an animal is worth knowing. "No," she said. "Short and real is better than long and uncertain." "That's what I think," Elias said. She looked at him sideways. He was watching Tommy and the dog, the thin autumn light on his face, and she thought about what he'd said the evening he'd proposed. "You're not nothing to me." And she thought about the morning he'd checked on her son's fever at dawn without waking her, and the way he'd moved through Edna Pruitt like she was weather rather than an obstacle. and the care in his hands on the fences and the ledgers, and the one time he'd steadied her at the gate with just the brief pressure of his palm. She was not going to make more of things than they were. But she was also standing here on the steps of a courthouse in Guthrie, with her name newly changed and her son making friends with a stranger's dog, not going to pretend that nothing had happened to her, quietly and without her full permission, over the last 6 weeks. "Vincent will hear about this quickly," she said. "Good. He'll try something else." "He can try." Elias put his hat back on against the cold. "He's not the first person who's thought they could wait me out." Below them, Tommy had gotten the dog to roll over, which he announced with a sound of pure triumph. Nora came down the steps. She didn't take Elias's arm or reach for his hand because it was too new and too complicated, and she didn't want to perform anything for the street or for herself. But she walked down beside him, and he matched his pace to hers, and they went to collect Tommy and their wagon and the long drive home. And whatever was coming, whatever Vincent Gray was building in a hotel room in Tanner's Crossing with a Guthrie lawyer's advice in his ear, it would come to a house where the legal ground was now solid and where 3 people had decided, in their own unannounced way, to stand on it together. Vincent Gray filed his petition 11 days after the wedding. Nora found out the way most bad news found its way to the Ward Ranch, through Roy Cutter, who had heard it from the grain mill operator, who had it from a man who'd been in the county clerk's office in Guthrie when the paperwork came through. Cutter rode over on a Friday afternoon with the particular expression of someone delivering information they'd rather not carry. "It's formal," he said, sitting at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands. "Petition for guardianship of the minor child Thomas Daniel Voss, on grounds of parental instability and financially motivated remarriage." He looked at Nora, then at Elias. "He's got Marcus Hale representing him. Hale's the best civil lawyer in the territory. He doesn't take cases he doesn't think he can win." Elias said, "When's the hearing?" 6 weeks. Judge Alderman, out of Guthrie." "Alderman," Elias repeated, I repeated, and his tone was a flat thing that told Nora the name meant something. "You know him?" she asked. "He ruled against a man named Pritchard 2 years ago. Land dispute. Pritchard's wife had come to the property after the land was established, and Alderman ruled her presence didn't constitute joint interest." He was quiet for a moment. "He's not unfair, but he reads arrangements literally." Cutter turned his hat in his hands. "The language in the petition is sharp. Hale wrote it. It says the marriage was conducted with unusual speed following Gray's visit, that there is no evidence of prior relationship, and that the financial circumstances of Mrs. Ward—" He paused on the new name, and Nora noticed. "Suggests the marriage was motivated by legal strategy rather than genuine union." "That's not wrong about the timing," Nora said. "Nora," Elias started. "It's not wrong. 11 days is not a long acquaintance." She looked at Cutter. "What does Hale intend to argue in court?" "That the marriage is a legal construction designed to block a legitimate custody claim. That Tommy would be better served by a guardian with stable financial resources and established community standing." Cutter's jaw tightened slightly. "He'll also argue that Elias's own grief history makes him an unsuitable guardian for a young child." The kitchen went very quiet. "He'll bring up Clara," Elias said. "He'll bring up the losses, both of them." Cutter set his hat on the table, which meant he was staying. "I'm sorry, Elias. Hale digs." Elias sat with that for a moment, and Nora watched his face, the stillness that moved across it, the way he absorbed things without letting them show until he had decided what to do with them. He was doing it now, working through it. "We need a lawyer," she said. "I know one in Guthrie," Cutter said. "Not Hale's level, but solid. Name's Deering. He's handled family matters before." "Get him," Elias said. "I'll ride out Monday." "Tomorrow," Elias said. Cutter looked at him, then nodded and picked up his hat. He left without finishing his coffee. Nora told Tommy that evening that they would need to go to Guthrie for a court hearing. She told him it was about Uncle Vincent wanting to make sure he was safe, which was true in the way that things said to children needed to be true, carrying the fact without the full weight of what the fact meant. Tommy listened with the steady attention he'd developed over the past months, a seriousness that sat on him more naturally now than it had when they'd first arrived. "Is he going to take me?" Tommy asked. "No," she said. He looked at her with her own eyes, the dark ones he'd gotten from her side of the family, and she recognized in them the specific quality of a child deciding whether the adult in front of them is being honest or protective. She had learned to tell the difference, too, from the inside. "We're going to fight it," she said, "and we're going to win." "How do you know?" "Because what Vincent wants isn't actually about you, and when that's the truth, it usually comes out." Tommy looked at the table. "What does he want?" She decided not to lie about this. "Your father left you money. Not a lot, but some. Your grandfather put it aside for you. Vincent wants to control it." "Why?" "Because he always wants to control things that aren't his." Tommy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Would Elias have to leave too if Vincent won?" "No, this is Elias's ranch. He'd stay." "But we'd go?" "We'd go." She kept her voice level. "That's why we're not going to let that happen." He nodded, slow, and went to bed without arguing about it, which was how she knew he was scared. Tommy argued about bedtime the way other children breathed, reflexively, constantly, as a matter of principle. When he didn't argue, something had gotten to him. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after. Elias came in from the barn at 9:30 and found her there with the lamp burning low and the account books open in front of her, even though she hadn't been reading them. "He's scared," she said. "I know." He poured himself water from the pitcher and sat down. "So are you." "I'm furious. It's different." "It's not that different." She looked at him. He was watching her with the level, direct attention that still sometimes caught her off guard, the way he looked at things without softening his gaze to make them easier to bear. "If we lose," she started, "we're not going to lose." "Elias, if we lose, I need to know. We're not going to lose because we're going to tell the truth, and the truth is on our side." He set the cup down. "Vincent Gray is a man who wants money that doesn't belong to him and has dressed it up in language about the boy's welfare. That's what the court is going to see. Courts don't always see what's in front of them." "No, but they usually see what you show them." He paused. "You told me once that you're usually honest even when it's not the easier thing. That's what Deering is going to put in front of aldermen. The honest version. What happened and why and what this is." She pressed her fingers to her forehead. "They're going to ask about Clara in court." "I know. They're going to ask why a man who lost his wife and children 3 years ago is suddenly willing to take on a widow and her son after 6 weeks. Hale will make it look like you were vulnerable, like I found you vulnerable." "Then I'll tell them I wasn't." His voice was quiet and matter-of-fact. "I was alone, and I was sad, and I had been both of those things for 3 years. That's not vulnerability. That's just a life that had gone one direction and needed to go another." A pause. "I'll tell them what I saw when you came through that gate. A woman holding a sick child and asking for work, not asking for rescue. That's what I'll say." She looked at him across the table, this man who spoke carefully and meant everything he said, and felt something in her chest do a complicated thing she didn't have a clean name for. "What if that's not enough?" she said. "Then we find what else there is, and we use that too." He pushed back from the table. "Get some sleep. We're going to Guthrie tomorrow to see Deering." Martin Deering was a compact, slightly rumpled man of about 50 who operated out of a 2-room office above the land registry and who had, according to Roy Cutter, won 60% of the family cases he'd taken in the past decade, which Cutter offered as a recommendation and Deering himself offered with a shrug when Nora cited the number. 40% loss rate's not something I brag about, he said, but family law in this territory is not a clean business. He had the petition open on his desk and was reading it with the particular focused stillness of a man who read things the way a doctor read symptoms, looking for what was underneath. "Hale's good. He's taken a real situation, your quick marriage, your financial circumstances before it, and framed it as manipulation. The question is whether the frame holds when we put the actual picture in it." "What do you need from us?" Elias said. "Everything. How you met, what happened, in what order, who said what when." He looked at Nora. "The custody claim hinges on 2 things, that your marriage was not genuine and that your situation before the marriage demonstrated instability that puts Tommy at risk. We need to dismantle both." He folded his hands. The second one is actually the easier one. You've been managing accounts for a ranch operation. You kept a sick child alive across 4 days of frontier travel. You have Roy Cutter willing to testify to your character, and I'll get 2 or 3 other names from the area before the hearing. He looked at Elias. The first one is harder, because Hale is right that 6 weeks is not a long acquaintance. It's long enough to know a person, Elias said. That's not what a court reads it as. Then how do we make a court read it right? Nora asked. Deering leaned back. We tell them a story, not a fabricated one, the real one, in detail, with specificity, because specificity is the thing that separates truth from performance. Anyone can say we fell in love. Not everyone can say this is the moment I knew something had changed, and here's exactly what it was and what was said and what I thought afterward. He looked between them. I need you to think back, both of you, not about the big things, the proposal, the ceremony, what it meant, the small things, the things that happened between you that nobody orchestrated and nobody could have planned. The room was quiet. Nora thought about a cold cloth on the right spot behind her son's ear, a pantry reorganized without comment, an almost smile that made it further than usual and then didn't. Elias said, She fixed the error in my county ledger in about 15 seconds. I'd been looking for it for an hour. Deering looked at him. That's not what I meant. I know, but that was when I started paying attention. He looked at the desk. And she cleared the rose garden. My wife planted it. I hadn't been able to touch it for 3 years, and Nora cleared it and cut it back and didn't ask permission and didn't explain herself, and the plant started putting out new growth. A pause. I noticed that. Deering wrote something down. And you? He said to Nora. She thought for a moment. He checked on Tommy's fever before dawn without waking me. I didn't find out until later, from Tommy. She stopped. And when we were fixing the fence in the rain, he didn't treat me like I needed managing. He just worked beside me and expected me to keep up, and I did. That was, she paused. Nobody had done that for a while. Deering wrote, Good, I need more of that. Dates, when you can approximate them. Who else was present? What was said? He set the pen down. Vincent Gray has money and Hale has a sharp argument. What you have is the truth and a set of details that money can't manufacture. We're going to use every one of them. Dumb. The 6 weeks before the hearing were the hardest of Nora's time on the ranch, and not for the reason she'd have expected. The practical pressures were manageable. Deering sent questions regularly, which she and Elias answered in writing and in 2 more trips to Guthrie. The ranch work continued, the fall harvest, the preparation for winter, the animals and the fences, and the accounts that didn't pause for legal proceedings. Tommy did his lessons and helped with the lighter sorting and continued his education of Elias on the topic of which horses had distinct personalities, a subject Elias engaged with more willingly than Nora had expected. What was hard was the other thing, the living side by side with a man she had married for practical reasons that had begun quietly and without permission to feel like something else, and not knowing what to do with that while they were also preparing to sit in front of a judge and testify about whether their marriage was real. She was aware of the irony. She was also aware that the best way to handle it was to do what she had always done with things that were complicated and not yet ready to be examined, set them on a shelf and keep working. What she hadn't expected was Elias. He was not a man who explained himself, who went in for the kind of conversation that circled toward a subject from 3 directions before landing on it. But something had shifted in him in the weeks since Guthrie said, a slight, unmistakable change in how he occupied the same spaces as her. He was not less contained, not dramatically different, not doing anything she could point to and name precisely, but he was present in a way he hadn't been before. More likely to pause in the kitchen when he would previously have moved through, more likely to say a thing rather than let it sit unspoken. One evening, about 2 weeks before the hearing, they were going through Deering's latest set of questions at the kitchen table after Tommy was in bed. The questions were specific and occasionally uncomfortable. Describe a disagreement you have had and how it was resolved. What does your spouse do that irritates you? What do you admire about them? The kind of thing designed to reveal whether a couple actually knew each other or had memorized a script. What do I do that irritates you? Nora read aloud. Elias didn't look up from his page. You reorganize things and don't tell me where you've put them. I tell you. You tell me eventually. That's still telling you. She wrote it down. Your turn. What do I do that irritates you? I just said. I mean, what do I do, from your perspective, for Deering? He looked up. That is my perspective. She wrote it down. You argue about rope technique with a 6-year-old. He was quiet for a moment. He was using the wrong grip. He's 6. The wrong grip is still the wrong grip at 6. He looked back at his page. Put that down. She wrote it. Husband corrects son's rope technique regardless of age appropriateness. She looked at it and something moved through her chest. The realness of it, the specific, useless, completely authentic detail of it. That was the thing Deering had said to look for, the thing nobody could manufacture. What do you admire? She said. He was quiet for longer this time. She waited. That you told Tommy the truth about what Vincent wanted, he said, when it would have been easier to protect him from it. He set his pen down. Most people, when they're scared, simplify things for the people they love. Make it smaller so it's easier to carry. You didn't do that. You trusted him to carry the real version. A pause. I admire that. She looked at the table. Your turn, she said, which came out quieter than she intended. You go. She thought for a moment. That you told me about Clara in the middle of fixing a fence in the rain, with no particular expectation that I'd do anything useful with it. Just said it, because it was true, and you'd decided to say it. She paused. I admire that it doesn't occur to you to be indirect about things that hurt. He looked at her then. Really looked, the way he did when he'd decided something. Nora, he said, we should finish the questions. The questions can wait. She looked up. I want to say something that isn't for Deering, he said. That's just between us. She set her pen down. I know the way this started, he said. I know what I proposed and why and what the terms were as I stated them. I'm not trying to rewrite that. He held her gaze steadily. But I'd like you to know that it's not that, for me, anymore. Whatever it started as. He stopped. I don't know what you want me to do with that. I'm not asking you to say the same thing. I just wanted you to know it, so you know what's there. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood near the fence, the dry autumn sound of it. She said, It's not only that for me either. He nodded, once. The kind of nod that closed a thing and opened something else at the same time. Okay, he said, and picked up his pen, and they went back to the questions. What? The hearing was on a Thursday in early November, in a courtroom in Guthrie that smelled like wood polish and old paper, and the particular institutional anxiety of a room where decisions were made that people had to live with. Judge Alderman was in his late 60s, compact, white-haired, with the expression of a man who had heard a great deal and been surprised by very little of it. He ran a precise courtroom. He did not appear to be moved by theatrical performance, which was either good news or bad news depending on what you were planning to perform. Vincent was there with Marcus Hale, and Nora made herself look at them directly and keep looking until the looking didn't cost her anything. Hale was younger than she'd expected, mid-40s, thin, with the alert, efficient manner of a man who worked in language the way a craftsman worked in wood. He nodded at Deering across the room with professional courtesy and no warmth. Vincent looked at Nora, then at Elias, then at Tommy, who was seated beside Roy Cutter in the gallery because Deering had said the boy's presence would matter, that a judge needed to see who they were actually deciding about. Tommy sat very still with his hands in his lap and his good shirt buttoned to the collar and the expression of someone doing a very hard thing because they'd been asked to. She looked away from him before she stopped being able to. Hale's opening was precise and unpleasant. He built the picture he'd promised to build. A widow with no resources, a grieving man with no family, a sudden marriage 11 days after a custody threat, a child used as leverage in 2 directions simultaneously. He was careful never to say anything that wasn't technically defensible, which was its own kind of skillfulness. He made the sequence of events sound like a series of calculations, each one following the last with the cold logic of a woman who had looked at an opportunity and taken it. Nora sat straight and kept her face still. Deering's opening was shorter. He said, "We are going to tell you what actually happened in the order it happened, and you will see that the picture council has drawn is not the picture that exists." He said it without drama, which was the right call. They put Elias on the stand first. Hale went at him carefully, the way you went at something solid, testing for the seam, the weakness, the place where the structure gave. He asked about Clara. He asked about the grief, the 3 years, the emptiness of the ranch. He asked whether Elias would characterize himself as isolated. He asked whether a man in that state might be susceptible to a sympathetic presentation. "No," Elias said. "You don't think grief affects judgment?" "I think it affects some people's judgment. It didn't affect mine." "You married a woman you'd known 6 weeks." "Yes." "That doesn't suggest impaired judgment to you?" "It suggests I knew what I was looking at." Elias's voice was level, not defensive, not performing. "I've been running a property alone for 3 years. I know the difference between a person who shows up for what they can get and a person who shows up and works." "And which was Mrs. Ward?" "She fixed a fence section in the rain with a cut on her hand and didn't mention it until we were done. She found an error in my county ledger in 15 seconds that I'd been looking for an hour. She cleared my wife's rose garden without being asked and without making a point of it." A pause. "That's not a woman who came here to take something. That's a woman who showed up and made things better than they were." Hale shifted. "And you felt nothing romantic toward her in those 6 weeks?" Elias was quiet for a moment. "I felt something. I didn't act on it until there was a reason to act on it, and when there was a reason, I was honest with her about what I was proposing and why." "You proposed marriage as a legal strategy." "I proposed marriage because it was the right thing to do for her and for the boy, and because I wanted them to stay." He looked at Hale without blinking. "Both of those things are true at the same time. I don't see a contradiction." Deering, on redirect, asked him one question. "Mr. Ward, if Vincent Gray had never come to this county, do you believe you would still have married Nora Voss?" Elias said, "Eventually, yes." Hale objected. Alderman allowed it. What? Nora's testimony was harder because Hale had more material to work with. The journey, the desperation, the timing, all of it laid out in the petition in language designed to make need sound like predation. He went through it methodically, and she answered everything directly, and she did not apologize for any of it, which she could feel surprised him slightly because he'd been expecting either defensiveness or collapse, and she gave him neither. When he asked about the timing of the proposal, she said, "Vincent came to the ranch the week before. Elias proposed the morning after. The timing looks like strategy because it was strategy. The strategy of a man who saw a problem and solved it. The question is whether the solution was honest, and it was." "You didn't have feelings for Mr. Ward at that point?" She thought about the fence, the ledger, the rose garden, Tommy in the barn with a brush and Elias running out of logical objections, the porch in the dark with the stars out and the silence that had started to feel like company. "I had feelings that I hadn't named yet," she said. "That's different from not having them." Hale paused, then moved on, which told her the answer hadn't helped him. Deering's redirect was brief. "Mrs. Ward, what do you want for your son?" She looked at Tommy in the gallery, at his careful, still face and his good shirt and his hands folded in his lap. "I want him to grow up on that ranch," she said. "I want him to learn to read rain clouds and tie rope and take care of animals and do his letters even when he doesn't want to. I want him to have a father who tells him the truth about things and expects him to be capable of it. That's what he has. That's what Vincent wants to take away." The courtroom was quiet for a moment after that. "Basta me." Hale called Vincent Gray. Vincent was polished on the stand, genuinely concerned in expression, measured in language. He spoke about Daniel's memory and Tommy's well-being with the skill of a man who had rehearsed caring. He spoke about the inheritance, a modest sum, he said, but significant for a child's future, and about his desire to see it properly administered. He spoke about the risks of a hastily constructed arrangement, about the vulnerability of grief, about the importance of stability. He was good. Nora had to give him that. Deering cross-examined him with a quietness that took a moment to understand was deliberate. "Mr. Gray, when did you last see your nephew before arriving at the Ward Ranch?" A pause. "At my brother's funeral?" "In June." "Yes." "So you were not in contact with Thomas in the months between your brother's death and your arrival in Tanner's Crossing?" "I was, making inquiries about their situation." "Inquiries, not visits." "Correct." "You didn't send money. You didn't send supplies. You didn't write to Mrs. Voss to offer assistance." Deering let that sit for a moment. "You hired a man to locate her." "I was concerned. You hired a man to locate her after learning the terms of your brother's will." Deering set a document on the judge's bench. "I'd like to enter into record correspondence between Mr. Gray and an attorney in Salinas, dated August of this year, 3 months before his visit to the ranch. In this correspondence, Mr. Gray asks specifically about the legal pathway to guardianship of a minor whose custodial parent is, and I'm quoting, in unstable or unsuitable circumstances." He looked up. "Mr. Gray, had you located your nephew's mother by August of this year?" A pause. "Not precisely." "So you were inquiring about custody law before you had even found the child you claimed to be concerned about?" Vincent's lawyer objected. Alderman looked at the document and overruled it. "He was already building the case," Nora heard someone in the gallery murmur, and she kept her eyes forward. The thing that broke it open came from a direction nobody had planned. Deering had given Nora a list of witnesses he intended to call. Roy Cutter, the Guthrie justice of the peace who had done the ceremony. A woman from Tanner's Crossing who had worked alongside Nora at the Harvest Cooperative. He had not listed a woman named Margaret Gray. Margaret Gray was Vincent's mother. Daniel's mother. She was 62 years old and had traveled from Salinas with a companion and arrived at the courthouse that morning before proceedings began, and Deering had met with her in a side room for 30 minutes with an expression afterward that Nora had not been able to read. Alderman called a short recess mid-afternoon, and when proceedings resumed, Deering called Margaret Gray to the stand. She was a small woman, white-haired, with the composed bearing of someone who had spent a long time being disappointed and had decided to do something about it at last. She looked at Vincent once when she sat down and then did not look at him again. Deering asked her to state her relationship to the parties. She did. He asked her about Daniel's will. She confirmed the inheritance, $72 held in trust, a small parcel of land in Hendricks County that Daniel had inherited from his grandfather, and the land's mineral rights, which were unresolved in value but potentially significant. He asked whether she had spoken to Vincent about Tommy's custody. "He called it safeguarding the family's interests," she said. Her voice was clear and without wobble. "He told me the land might be worth something when the rail survey came through. He said if the boy was under proper guardianship, the family could ensure the inheritance was handled correctly." By properly handled, what did he mean? She folded her hands in her lap. "He meant he would control it." A pause. "I loved my son Daniel. He was a better man than his brother in every way that matters. What Vincent is doing here is not about Tommy. I've watched him build this story for 4 months, and I can't watch it go any further." She looked at Alderman. "Tommy's mother loves that boy. She walked across broken country for 4 days carrying him sick. That's not a woman calculating an inheritance. That's a mother." Her voice was level throughout. "Vincent wants the land rights. That's all this is." The courtroom was not exactly silent. It was the kind of not quite silence that happens when a room full of people is very carefully not reacting. Hale's cross-examination of Margaret Gray was short and did not recover much ground. Setit. Alderman did not rule immediately. He called a 2-day recess to review the record, which Deering said was standard, and which felt to Nora like standing at the edge of something very high and waiting to find out if there was ground beneath it. They drove back to the ranch and did the work that needed doing, because the work didn't pause for court recesses any more than it paused for anything else. Nora fixed a section of the garden fence that had gone soft at the base. Elias repaired the water pump. Tommy did his letters and didn't ask about the hearing, which meant he was thinking about it constantly. The second evening, sitting on the porch in the early dark with the cold coming in from the north and the first stars out, Tommy came and sat between them without being asked and leaned against Nora's arm and didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "Grandma Margaret came." "She did," Nora said. "Is she on our side?" "She told the truth. That's everyone's side." Tommy considered this. "Uncle Vincent's going to be mad at her." "Probably." "She did it anyway." "She did." He was quiet again. The horse in the paddock moved against the fence, a soft sound in the dark. Elias had his arms on his knees and was looking at the ridge the way he did sometimes, and Tommy shifted slightly and leaned against his arm too, and Elias didn't move away, just sat with the boy's weight against him. "Whatever happens," Elias said, "you're not going anywhere, Tommy." Tommy looked up at him. "How do you know?" "Because I'll make sure of it." He said it flat and quiet, the way he said things he meant all the way down. "That's not something you need to worry about." Tommy looked at him for a long moment with those steady dark eyes, doing the thing he did where he decided if something was true. Then he nodded, once, and went back to looking at the stars. Nora looked at Elias over the top of Tommy's head. He looked back. There was nothing that needed saying. Alderman's ruling came on a Friday morning. Deering brought it in person, riding out from Guthrie in the cold, and he came through the gate with his hat pushed back and an expression on his face that told her before he opened his mouth. He read the relevant section. The court finds insufficient evidence to support the petitioner's claim that the respondent's marriage represents a bad faith legal construction. The court finds substantial evidence that the respondent, Nora Ward, has demonstrated consistent and genuine care for the minor child Thomas Voss, and that the respondent, Elias Ward, has provided a stable and appropriate environment for the child's welfare. The petition for guardianship is denied. Custody of Thomas Daniel Voss remains with his mother, Nora Ward. Tommy, who had been standing in the kitchen doorway, made a sound and came across the porch and into Nora's arms all in one motion, and she held him and felt his shoulders shaking against her and didn't say anything, just held on. Over his head, she looked at Elias. He was standing at the porch rail with his hands in his pockets and his face doing the thing it did when something had moved him, and he was deciding how much to let show. He looked at her and Tommy and then looked away at the yard and the bare cottonwood and the cold November sky, and his jaw moved once. "Thank you," he said. To Deering, to the yard, to whatever was listening. Deering shook his hand and said he'd send the final paperwork next week, and got back on his horse and rode out the way he'd come. And the three of them stood on the porch of the Ward Ranch in the thin winter light, with the ruling read and the fight over and the ground finally solid underfoot. And for a moment nobody said anything because nothing that needed saying hadn't already been said or shown or earned across the long, difficult weeks of earning it. Tommy pulled back from Nora's arms and wiped his face with his sleeve and said, with the dignity of a boy reassembling himself, "Can I go tell Bess?" Elias looked at him. "Yeah," he said. "Go tell Bess." Tommy went down the porch steps at a run, and they watched him go, and the morning held still around them, cold and clear and theirs. Tommy named the dog Alderman. Elias pointed out, with the measured tone of a man who had learned to pick his battles, that naming a dog after the judge who'd ruled in their favor was either very appropriate or very strange, and he couldn't decide which. Tommy said it was appropriate because Alderman, the judge, had let him stay, and Alderman, the dog, had also let him stay, by being the right dog at the right time and sitting still while Tommy petted him on the courthouse steps in Guthrie, and that seemed like enough reason. The dog was a medium-sized mutt of indeterminate heritage, mostly brown, with one ear that stood up and one that didn't, and he had been found by Roy Cutter wandering the road between his spread and the Ward Ranch in late November, about 3 weeks after the ruling came through. Cutter had brought him over with the air of a man delivering something he suspected was going to cause problems, and didn't much care, and Tommy had looked at the dog, and the dog had looked at Tommy, and that had been the end of any discussion about whether he was staying. Elias had said, "He'll need training." Tommy had said, "I know, you can help me," which was how Elias Ward, who had ranched alone for 3 years and kept his own company and not complained about it, found himself on a cold December morning in the yard teaching a 6-year-old and a 1-year dog the fundamentals of basic commands, with the particular resigned focus of a man who had made his peace with the fact that his household was no longer a quiet one and had decided that quiet was overrated anyway. Nora watched from the kitchen window and didn't say anything about it, because some things were better witnessed than commented on. The winter settled in hard that year, the kind of Oklahoma winter that came early and meant it. Snow by mid-December, the creek freezing at the edges, the horses needing extra feed and the pipes needing watching through the coldest nights. The ranch demanded more in winter than it gave, and the work was not romantic. It was cold and repetitive and occasionally brutal, the kind of physical labor that left you too tired for much beyond eating and sleeping, and that had its own strange comfort in it, the body too occupied for the mind to run in bad directions. They got through it together, which was both practical and something more than practical, in the way that most things between them had turned out to be. Elias was not a transformed man. He was still contained, still economical with words, still more comfortable with action than expression. He did not become suddenly easy or open or fluent in the language of domestic warmth. He remained himself, only himself, more fully and with less of the careful rationing that grief had required of him. There was a difference between a man who kept to himself because he had decided that was the safest thing, and a man who kept to himself because that was simply his nature. And Nora, over the winter months, came to understand which one she'd actually married. What changed was smaller and more durable than transformation. He started leaving his coffee cup on her side of the table in the morning, not hers specifically, but there, the way a person unconsciously orients toward a warmth they've gotten used to. He started saying we when he talked to Cutter about the ranch plans, which he hadn't done before. He fixed the rocking chair on the porch that had a loose joint, not because it was urgent, but because he'd noticed her sitting in it and noticed the wobble. He did these things without announcement and without expectation of acknowledgement, the way he did everything that mattered to him. She noticed. She didn't announce it either. In January, a letter came from Margaret Gray. It was addressed to Nora in the careful, upright hand of a woman who had learned penmanship in a different era and maintained it as a matter of principle. Nora read it at the kitchen table while Elias was in the barn, and Tommy was doing his letters with Alderman, the dog sleeping across his feet in the way that had become habitual, and that Tommy maintained was helpful because the weight kept him from fidgeting. Margaret wrote that Vincent had returned to Salinas. She wrote that he had been, and here her word choice was careful, lawyerly almost, as if she'd thought about it, advised by people he respected to abandon the custody matter and attend to his own business. Nora had the impression that Margaret Gray was one of the people who had done the advising, and that her version of advice was not the kind you ignored without consequence. She wrote that she thought about Daniel often, and that she thought he would be glad to know Tommy was somewhere good. She wrote that she had no claim on Nora's time or attention, but that if Nora was willing, she would like to correspond. She signed it Margaret, not Mrs. Gray, which was either an oversight or an overture. Nora read the letter twice. Then she went to the small desk in the parlor and wrote back. A letter that took her 3 drafts and 45 minutes and was ultimately just over a page. Not long, but honest, the way she tried to be with things that mattered. She told Margaret that Tommy was well, that he had a dog named after a judge, that he was learning to read weather and rope, and was making slow but genuine progress on his letters. She told her that Daniel's memory was kept in the house, not loudly, not as a performance of grief, but present, the way the memory of someone loved should be. She said she would like to correspond. She did not tell Elias about the letter until that evening, and when she did, he read it at the table without expression and set it down and said, "She did the right thing, in court." She did. Is she a good woman, you think, or is it complicated? Nora considered. I think she's a woman who loves her sons, and one of them was worth loving back, and the other wasn't, and she spent a long time not wanting to know the difference, and then she decided she had to know it. She paused. That seems human to me. Elias nodded. Write to her if you want. I already did. He looked at her, and the corner of his mouth moved. Of course you did. Was I supposed to wait? No. He stood up and took his cup to the counter. You're not good at waiting on things that are clearly the right thing to do. Is that a criticism? He thought about it with the genuine consideration he gave to most things. No, he said. It's an observation. Spring came, the way spring always came after a hard winter. Not all at once, but in increments. A day warm enough to work without a coat, followed by 3 days of cold, the ground thawing and refreezing, the creek unfreezing from the edges inward, the horses getting restless. The way animals got restless when the season was changing and they could feel it before you could see it. The roses came back, not in force, not dramatically. 3 plants put out proper budded growth by late April, the rest still working their way back from the deep cutback of 2 years ago, but 3 was enough. Nora saw the first tight green buds on a morning in the 3rd week of April and stood there in the early light the same way she'd stood there the previous September, looking at the first new shoots, except this time what she felt was different. Less like reprieve, more like proof. Things that had been through hard winters and come back were not the same as things that had never been tested. They were tougher at the root, more certain of themselves. She thought about that standing in the pale April light and thought that it was true of roses and probably true of people too, and that you couldn't know, while you were in the middle of being tested, whether you were going to be one of the things that came back or one of the things that didn't, and that uncertainty was the price you paid for having something worth keeping. Elias came around the side of the house and stopped when he saw her, and then saw what she was looking at. He came and stood beside her and looked at the 3 budded canes for a long moment without saying anything. Clara would have been, he started and stopped. What? Nora said. She would have been glad they came back. He said it simply, without pain and without performance. She was stubborn about those plants, planted them the 2nd spring we were here, and the 1st winter killed them all the way back, and she replanted in the spring and did it the same way every year until they held. He looked at the roses. She'd have liked knowing someone kept them going. Nora looked at the budded canes. I'll tell her you said so. He glanced at her sideways. People we've lost don't go completely away, she said. They just change addresses. She paused. That's not a metaphysical claim. It's just they're in the roses and in the barn and in the way Tommy sits a certain way that reminds me of Daniel. They're in things. She looked at him. I don't think that's a bad thing. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. It's not a bad thing. They stood there a while longer, the April morning around them thin and cold and bright, and then Tommy appeared at the kitchen door hollering something about aldermen having gotten into the pantry again. And the moment ended the way most moments did, not with ceremony, but with the next thing, which was already happening. She was 3 months along when she told him, in May, on an ordinary evening after supper when Tommy was in the barn with the dog and the kitchen was warm from the stove and the window was open to let in the spring air that finally smelled like growth instead of cold. She just said it. She had learned from him, over the winter, that plain and direct was usually better than any other approach. I'm pregnant, she said. He had been sitting with a harness he was mending, and he set it down on the table with the careful attention of someone putting something down to make sure they didn't drop it. He looked at her. How far? He said. About 3 months. I wanted to be certain before I... She stopped. There was something in his face that she couldn't read yet, which was unusual because she'd gotten good at reading him over the months. Something was moving through him that hadn't finished moving. Elias. I'm here, he said. Say something. He looked at the table for a moment, and then he looked at her, and what she saw in his face was not what she'd been bracing for. Not fear, not retreat, not the careful sealing over of a man who had lost this before and couldn't afford to open to it again. It was something rawer than that, something that had gone very still because it was trying to hold a large and fragile thing. Okay, he said. That's all you have? No. He put both hands flat on the table. I have... He stopped, tried again. I had this before. You know that. I know. And I know what can happen. His voice was even, but it was costing him something. I'm not going to pretend I'm not scared of that. I know you are, but I'm... He stopped again, and this time the stop lasted long enough that she waited, because she'd learned that with Elias, the things that mattered most took the longest to arrive. I'm glad, he said finally. I'm glad, and I'm scared, and both of those things are about the same size. And I think that's probably right. He looked at her. I'm not going to be the kind of man who doesn't show up because he's scared of being hurt again. I was that man for 3 years and it didn't do anything useful. She felt something move in her chest, deep and warm. You were grieving. That's different from not showing up. Maybe. But I'd like to show up now. He held her gaze steadily, the way he held everything. I'd like the chance to do that right. She crossed the kitchen and sat down across from him at the table, close enough that she could see the specific color of his eyes in the evening light, that complicated green. You've been doing it right for months, she said. You don't have to start. He looked at her for a long time. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, which was not the kind of gesture he made easily or often, and she felt the warmth and weight of it and didn't move. How do you feel? He asked. Tired, a little sick in the mornings, afraid. She paused. And glad, same as you. He turned her hand over and held it properly, not gently exactly, but carefully, the way he held things he didn't want to damage. Tommy's going to want to name it, he said. She laughed, which was the right response and the true one. He's going to want to name it after another judge. Or the dog. We can't have 2 aldermans. We'll tell him that. He'll argue. I know. Something in his voice had softened by a degree she could feel more than hear. Let him argue. She told Tommy the next morning in the barn because that was where he received important information best. In the space he'd claimed as his own, with Bess and Alderman for company. He sat on the fence rail and listened with his characteristic stillness, and then said, Is it a boy or a girl? Too early to know. If it's a boy, can I name him? Absolutely not. He accepted this without argument, which was itself unusual enough to make her suspicious. Can I suggest a name? You can suggest? That means you'll think about it. That means I'll hear it. He thought for a moment, swinging his legs off the rail. What about Daniel? If it's a boy? She hadn't expected that. It sat in the air between them for a moment with more weight than most words. You want to name a baby after your father, she said carefully. Not like instead of anything. He looked at her with his clear, direct gaze. Just so there's still a Daniel. He paused. Elias's name stays because it's a real name and he's a real person here. But Daniel could be in there somewhere. In the middle, maybe. She thought about the letter to Margaret Gray, about things that changed addresses, about what it meant to carry someone forward without pretending they were still present in the form they used to be. I'll talk to Elias, she said. Tommy nodded, satisfied, and jumped down from the rail. He'll say yes, he said, with the confidence of someone who'd spent a year learning how a particular person made decisions. He's fair about things that matter. He was right. Elias said yes that evening without hesitation, which wasn't the same as it being easy. She could see that it wasn't entirely easy, but he said it and meant it, and that was the kind of man she had married. The baby was born in December, on a night when the first snow of the season was coming down outside, and the fire in the bedroom was burning well, and the midwife from Tanner's Crossing, a capable, unsentimental woman named Mrs. Holt, who had done this more times than she could count and took the same practical approach to it as she did to everything else, was in her element. It was a girl. Elias was downstairs for most of it, because Mrs. Holt had firm opinions about where men should be during a birth, and those opinions did not include the bedroom. He sat at the kitchen table with Tommy, who had been permitted to stay up because neither of them had made a convincing argument for why he shouldn't, and they played cards with the focused inattention of 2 people doing something with their hands because their minds were somewhere else. Tommy won 3 hands out of 5, which under normal circumstances would have prompted more scrutiny of the dealing. When Mrs. Holt came to the top of the stairs and said it was done and both were well, Elias stood up from the table fast enough that his chair scraped back hard on the floor, and Tommy was right behind him. Mrs. Holt made them wait in the hallway for another 10 minutes, which was the longest 10 minutes Elias Ward had experienced in recent memory. When she finally opened the door, she looked at both of them with the expression of someone who found human nature mildly amusing and stepped aside. Nora was sitting up against the headboard, tired in the specific way of someone who had done something enormous and survived it, her hair loose and her face flushed with the effort of the past hours. She was holding a very small, very red, very unimpressed-looking person wrapped in the blanket that Nora's own mother had made, which had lived in the bottom of the chest they'd brought from Millhaven and which Nora had gotten out 3 months ago without making any remark about it. Elias came in and stood at the side of the bed and looked at the baby for a moment without speaking. Tommy came in behind him and stood on his toes to see over the edge of the bed. "She's red," he said. "Babies are red," Nora said. "You were red." "I don't remember that." "You wouldn't." Tommy leaned further. The baby, who had been making small, dissatisfied sounds, opened its eyes, dark, unfocused, looking at something that wasn't there yet, and Tommy went completely quiet for a moment. "Hi," he said softly, to the baby. The baby did not respond, being 3 minutes old and unacquainted with social convention, but she blinked, which Tommy took as acknowledgement. Elias sat on the edge of the bed, carefully, and Nora shifted the baby toward him without being asked, which was an act of trust that he understood the full weight of. He took her, his hands, those large, careful hands, wrapping around something so small it seemed impossible, and held her with the steadiness of a man who had decided that steadiness was the thing he could offer, the thing he was good at, the thing that mattered. He looked at the baby's face for a long time. His jaw moved once. "Hello," he said. Just that. Quietly, to something very small that hadn't existed this morning and did now, that had his name by law and Daniel Voss's name in the middle by choice, and her own name, which they hadn't settled on yet, still to come. Nora watched him hold their daughter and felt something she didn't have a word for. Not happiness exactly, or not only that, but something broader and more complicated and more real than happiness. Something that had room in it for everything. For Daniel and Clara, for the hard winter and the fever and the courtroom and the long walk across 4 days of Oklahoma dust with a sick child and nothing but the refusal to quit. Something that understood that this moment was only possible because of all the other moments, including the worst of them. Especially the worst of them. Oh shit. They named her Rose. Tommy thought about it for a day and then said it was the right name, which mattered to both of her parents more than they would have expected. Elias looked at the rose garden when they told him and didn't say anything, which was his way of saying everything. Margaret Gray sent a gift, a small silver rattle and a letter of 4 paragraphs that was the warmest thing the woman had written yet, and Nora read it twice and put it in the box with the others, which now made a small but real correspondence. She had told Nora, in an earlier letter, that she had given Vincent a very clear accounting of what she thought of what he'd tried to do, and that he had not spoken to her since, and that she found the silence an improvement. Nora had not responded to that part, because some things didn't need comment. Roy Cutter came by in the first week of December with a bottle of something and the contained pleasure of a man who liked things to work out, and had been hoping they would. He held Rose for about 30 seconds, declared her a fine specimen, handed her back, and spent the rest of the visit telling Elias about a water access dispute with a neighbor 2 valleys over, which was apparently more interesting to both of them than the baby, though neither of them was going to say so. Nora fed Rose in the kitchen and listened to the 2 men talk and thought about the year, this impossible, grinding, improbable year, with the particular perspective that comes when you're on the other side of something and can finally look at the whole shape of it. Here is what she believed, having lived through it, that the things that mattered didn't announce themselves in advance. The moment that changed everything had not been a proposal or a courthouse or a verdict. It had been a cold cloth at the right spot behind a sick child's ear. It had been a man who went back to tending a horse without making her thank him. It had been the decision, in a barn doorway, to say yes to work instead of charity, and the other decision, in a kitchen, over a cup of coffee that was still hot, to say yes to something larger than she'd thought she was ready for. She believed that survival and love were not opposites, and that sometimes, often in fact, they were the same thing, or started that way and became indistinguishable over time. Elias had not rescued her. She had not rescued him. They had looked at each other clearly, under difficult circumstances, and decided the other person was worth the risk of being wrong, and they had both been right. She believed the hardest thing about belonging somewhere was that you couldn't be given it. People could open a door. And Elias had opened a door, had literally opened a door on a desperate evening when he had every reason not to. But you had to walk through it yourself, and keep walking, and do the work of making yourself at home in a place until home was what it actually was. Not a feeling you were handed, a thing you built with your hands, badly sometimes, with gaps in the structure and sections that needed redoing, but built and standing, and yours. She also believed, and this was the thing she'd learned from Tommy, from her 6-year-old son, who had been terrified on a porch in Guthrie and sat between two people and leaned against both of them and looked at the stars. That family was not a legal category, and not a blood category, and not a category at all. It was a practice. A daily practice of showing up for the same people, of being honest with them even when it was inconvenient, of taking care of their small needs without keeping score, of staying in the room when the room got hard. Elias Ward had a child who had been born this December, and a child who had arrived the previous August with a fever and a rope of questions about barn animals and an absolute refusal to stay out of other people's business. He did not love one more than the other. He did not love either of them easily or demonstratively, or in any way that was visible to people who didn't know how to look. But Tommy could tell you, in detailed and unprompted testimony, exactly what Elias had taught him, and exactly what Elias had said on 3 specific occasions that had mattered, and that was a child who knew he was loved in the only way that love could really be known. Not from what someone said, but from the accumulation of what they did. The winter that year was long but not brutal. The roses held under the snow. Nora checked, pulling the protective mulch back to look at the canes in January, finding them intact. Tommy turned 7 in February and received a book about weather systems and a new rope from Elias, and considered both equally valuable. Alderman the dog learned to sit and stay and come, and also learned that the pantry latch was beyond his abilities, which was a relief to everyone. Rose grew at the pace of all babies, which seemed slow until you looked back and realized how much had changed in a month, and she had her father's eyes, that dark, complicated green, and her mother's habit of watching everything very carefully before deciding what to do about it. Spring came again. On the first morning warm enough to work without a coat, Nora went out to the rose garden and pulled the mulch back fully, and the canes were green, all of them this time, every last plant. And there were buds forming on most of them, small and tight and definite. She crouched down in the dirt in the early morning light and put her fingers on one of the buds and felt it, the living pressure of it, the thing that had been here all winter, underground, doing the slow, invisible work of survival. Elias found her there. He came around the side of the house with Rose in his arms because she had been awake since 5, and this was where they'd gotten to, the two of them, him and the baby, making rounds of the yard in the early morning while Nora slept a little longer, which he had started doing without discussion, and which she had accepted without making anything of it, because that was how they did most things. He stopped when he saw her at the roses and stood there with the baby against his chest, and the morning light on both of them, and Nora looked up from where she was crouching in the dirt. "All of them," she said. "Every plant." He looked at the garden, at the full row of greening canes and the buds coming on strong. He looked for a while. "Good," he said. It was the same word he'd used about Tommy's fever breaking, about the county ledger error found, about the first fence section finished in the rain. Good. A small, plain word that he meant all the way through every time he said it. She had come to understand that when Elias Ward said good, he meant, "This is what I hoped for, and it's here, and I'm not going to make a larger production of that than it deserves, but I want you to know I notice it." She stood up from the garden and brushed the dirt from her knees and came to where he was standing. Rose looked at her from the security of Elias's shoulder with the bright, absolute attention of a 4-month-old who had just identified the person who fed her. "Good morning," Nora said to the baby. Rose made a sound of greeting that was mostly air and one consonant, but it was hers. Nora looked at Elias, this man who had opened a door, who had checked the chicken coop latch before the first cold came, who had said, "You're not nothing to me" across a kitchen table and meant it with the full weight of someone who did not say things they didn't mean, who was standing in the early spring light with their daughter against his chest and the look of a man who had been given something back that he'd stopped expecting. She's hungry, he said. I know. Nora reached for the baby. Come inside. He followed her in. Behind them, the rose garden caught the morning light. All the canes, all the buds, everything that had been cut back and covered and gone cold and survived it. And the light came across it long and gold and early, the way spring light did on the first morning that felt like spring, like it was finally, actually, permission. The ranch that had been quiet for 3 years was not quiet anymore. It was the sound of a dog on the porch steps, a 7-year-old's voice in the barn talking to a horse about cloud formations, a baby making her opinion known from inside the house, and underneath all of it, the steady and ongoing sound of a life that had not gone the direction anyone planned and had turned out, against considerable odds and through considerable difficulty, to be exactly enough.